Hello, hello, hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Inglês no Rádio. Today is a special episode, a special quarantine edition of the show. And today I am here with Joseph, with Joe, the owner and operator, I suppose, of the Toronto English School. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Foster. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So, just to give all of our listeners kind of the setup, I got in touch with Joe. Actually, Joe got in touch with me. I believe you saw one of our videos with Anne Marie from Speak Confident English, and Joe reached out with a really nice message talking about pronunciation. So, a quick tip to everyone listening: if you want to get my attention, just talk about pronunciation, and I will probably respond. So, Joe, to be honest, we don't know each other all that well. So, if you could just give us a little bit of background about who you are, where you're from, what you do, that kind of thing, that'd be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, I own and operate Toronto English School, and as many of you probably can guess from the name, I'm in Toronto. And I also focus quite a bit on pronunciation and other things as well, but all of my students are Japanese. They're in Toronto usually on working holiday visas. And during this difficult time, I've got some extra time on my hands, so I'm starting to develop an online course as well.
Awesome. Excellent. So, I think the first thing that a lot of our listeners will be interested in, because most of our listeners are Brazilian, and for one reason or another, Brazilians tend to love Canada, and I would say in particular Toronto. So, how would you rate Toronto as a place to live, as a place to visit? I've been to the airport many times, but never actually set foot in the city.
Right. Well, like most of Canada, very friendly. Um, okay, for Brazilians, the winter is going to be brutal. So if you're ever here and you survive, you'll be able to survive anything. But the summers are short, but a lot of fun. Canadians maximize every sunny day, warm day in the summer. We're always out enjoying festivals. There's so many great restaurants. Toronto's so multicultural as well. So amazing food, great shopping, lots of things to do outdoors.
Yeah, I want to say that I read recently, this could be totally wrong or totally biased, but that Toronto might be the most culturally diverse city in the world.
If it's not true, it's definitely in the
It's
top
up
three.
there.
Um, it's up there. I mean, there's a few multicultural cities in Canada, excuse me, like Montreal and Vancouver, but Toronto seems to have someone from everywhere.
That's awesome. So it's got
Yeah,
something for everyone.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Cool. So Joe, what about your background in teaching and in languages? How did that come about?
Well, after graduating from university, I eventually got into teachers college and graduated with primary junior certification, which means I could teach elementary school up to grade 6. But before I got my feet wet in Toronto, I traveled abroad to Asia and taught there for a few years on and off in a couple of places, Taiwan and Singapore specifically. And when I returned, I got into the school system for a few years. Wasn't quite what I thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Gave it a good shot, but decided to take advantage of an opportunity that presented itself and redirected my career towards fashion, menswear
Mm-hmm.
specifically, in manufacturing. And after doing that for a while, I got the itch to get back into the classroom, but decided to do it on my own terms. So I started doing private English lessons and just slowly, gradually developed my own style, my own curriculum, which, as you know, focuses heavily on pronunciation because the more Japanese students that I taught, the more I saw the pattern that they all had the same problems. And most of those problems, other than, a shortage of vocabulary or some grammar hiccups, The more serious problems were pronunciation, connected speech, and I thought that that was really the main obstacle to their improvement, significant improvement, I would say. Um, a lot of them had studied in big language schools, but when they
Boo.
come to me, yeah, I mean, the shocking thing is that they still can't pronounce basic sounds after studying for 3 to 6 months,
Yeah.
which boggles
And
my
many
mind.
times years. I have students that have lived in the US for decades and can't pronounce basic words. Yeah.
Right. And the cool thing is, once you start, you know, showing them along that path, they start to get improvements. They start to feel more confident, and then they get excited again and motivated again to learn English, whereas they kind of lost that passion when they got mired in grammar textbooks and, idioms. And like idioms to me is just a waste of time. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, let's sit down and crack open this idiom textbook. That's going to be a good time.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So it sounds like you have a relatively, or at least I have a relatively similar path to you in the sense that I started in my background in education, was kind of disillusioned by it all, got out of education for a little while, and then came back doing it on my own terms and through a long, winding road, ending up focusing on pronunciation. So I I feel you. This feels like quite a
Yeah,
meeting of the
and
minds.
yeah, exactly. And it was just all organic and natural, it's wherever the demand was, the need was, that's where the lessons naturally went. And it was pronunciation. And there's a real lack of good pronunciation instruction going around.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think we're both trying
Yeah.
to make a dent in that. So, just two things that stick out to me first. Joe, speaking of pronunciation, I imagine this is a Canadian American thing. I say pronunciation, and I hear you saying pronunciation. Is that correct?
That is, yes.
Fun. Do you know of any other
Yeah.
fun Canadian American differences?
Hmm. Nothing comes to mind. The funny thing is, I guess I'm oblivious to it being in Canada,
Hmm.
but a lot of Americans will point out that we say about
Yeah,
differently.
yeah. I don't hear that
I
with
don't
you,
hear it.
but I hear it with some people
Yeah.
about kind of a more,
Yes.
um, there's more movement to the diphthongs, perhaps. Cool. So, just a quick question. You traveled and studied and taught in Asia, and you own and operate an English school principally or exclusively for Japanese students. I imagine you speak Japanese. Is that correct?
I don't speak Japanese.
Interesting.
Yes. I've never had a need for it. Well, of course, I know some bad words in Japanese, but that's not appropriate for the classroom. But yeah, that's the bad influence of my students, I suppose. Um, no, I've never needed Japanese, which in a way, there's pros and cons, of course. It forces me to find a way to explain it in English,
Yeah,
um, but it also forces me to find a way to explain it in English when things are a little bit difficult to explain. So
yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of more just that's where you fell into teaching Japanese students and you found a place that you liked.
yeah, that's right. I mean, just word of mouth and the opportunities for marketing presented themselves, and they're really great people. They're very enthusiastic about learning, which is fantastic. I suppose that's one advantage to teaching adults is that they choose to be there.
Yeah,
And
most of the time. Yeah.
yeah, and there's just no shortage of people to help. So it's
Awesome.
just how it worked out. Yeah.
Excellent. So when we spoke earlier, you kind of mentioned that many of your students have perhaps already studied English before or studied in one of the bigger, more traditional schools, and they tend to find you kind of at the end of their language learning journey. So I imagine most of your students they have a preconception of what a language school is, what they expect to learn, and you kind of have to combat that a bit. Is that more or less the case?
It is. There's a lot of myths that are still very strong and supported by big schools and by government institutions. Um, as you know, grammar is a huge one where students just they just love those grammar textbooks.
they're
um,
just they're so good. You can
yeah,
they're
they're so
page
good.
turners.
Yeah, the results are so amazing. Um, I guess I understand why that is. I mean, it's easy to teach. It's straightforward to teach. It's straightforward to study. There's a question with a right answer or a wrong answer. And pronunciation is more abstract. It's harder to know if you're improving, if you're studying pronunciation and things like that.
Yeah, much more
But
difficult to teach as
yes,
well.
much more difficult to teach. Um, but it's just look at the results. I mean, it's I shouldn't have to try and convince anyone that grammar is not the way to go because the results aren't there. You know, they study these grammar rules their whole lives in high school and in big language schools, and when they speak, they're still making very simple grammar mistakes.
Yeah,
And of
yeah,
course, they understand the rules, they've studied the rules, they know the rules, but I tell them, and I've heard you say a different version of this, but basically, understanding something is not the same as doing it automatically
hmm
or learning it deeply.
yeah,
And but that's a huge myth that grammar is the way to go. I don't agree with it. You know, if people want a general understanding of basic grammar, I say go
yeah.
for it.
That's
But
cool. Yeah,
that's cool. But don't shut yourself in at your desk for hours on end. Get out, start talking to people. You know, work that mouth muscle.
yeah. I've thought of it depends on my mood, and I always have a different analogy for kind of like implicit learning versus learning something explicitly. And I think the one I'm sitting with right now is just like riding a bike. Like if you're taking the pronunciation route, the more natural way to learn a language, you just kind of ride a bike. You don't really understand the mechanics. On the other hand, you can have a PhD in bicycle mechanics and like physics or whatever, and that does not help you at all to actually ride the bike, which is the point.
Absolutely. Again, a meeting of the minds. My angle is if you want to learn to play guitar, would you crack open a guitar textbook and just read about it for hours on end and then pick it up and start playing right away? No, you got to pick up a guitar and use your hands and learn those chords through repetition, repetition, repetition. Get that muscle memory working.
Yeah, that's something I've recognized a lot recently because I do play guitar. I play a lot of instruments, and with the quarantine, I've had a lot of extra time to brush up on my music. And I recognize, like, I was just watching a lot of YouTube videos about like different guitar techniques, and I was like, oh, I'm not actually playing guitar. I'm not improving. So it's easy to forget. I get where people are coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joe, if you had to, because a lot of our listeners have heard me make this case in some form or another many times. But if you had a normal student of yours, a new student that comes to the school, they probably have a background in English, at least like the basic fundamentals of English. And you kind of had to take them through the process of learning in a more a traditional way. What would that process look like for a new student that comes to you?
Yeah, sure. Well, usually that starts with a trial lesson. And the purpose for me for the trial lesson is to shock them out of their system, shock that traditional learning out of their system. And the way I do that is I focus on, well, I basically, in a very sneaky way, I set them up to shock themselves.
Yeah.
So I'll ask them, for example, what's the most difficult sound for them to learn in English? And 90% they'll say either R or L sound.
hmm
Sometimes they'll say TH sound as well. That's a tough one for a lot of different languages.
Yeah, I would say for Brazilians, the TH is probably up there.
Right. And, I'll tell them, okay, well, why don't we just do a little practice? And through the practice, I usually get a gaping mouth at some point because they realize that vowel sounds are way more important, have totally been neglected, and they have no idea how to pronounce them. And that's why when they say something like stuff, they really mean to say staff. And
Yeah,
there's a million of those combinations where A and U can be flipped and the meaning is totally different.
absolutely. Okay, so this is another point of agreement with us that I'm a strong believer that vowels are strongly outweigh consonants. If you have to rank them, vowels win every time.
Every time.
But I recently heard on another podcast with a pronunciation teacher that I like very much and respect very much, and not going to name names, but essentially she was laying out the case for consonants, and I was
Hmm.
kind of baffled. Like, huh. So, can you give me your take of why you think vowels are of utmost importance?
My pleasure. Well, basically, every word has a vowel. And not every word, of course, every word also has consonants, last time I checked. But in terms of problem consonants, not there are always going to be similarities between languages. For example, the K sound between English and Japanese is the same. So obviously that's not going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there's about 8 or 9 consonants that Japanese have problems with. And not all words have those consonants every time. But every word has vowels. And more importantly, if a student goofs on a vowel sound, the meaning of the word can be completely different, which makes the meaning of the sentence completely different.
Yeah.
Whereas if they goof on an R or an L or a TH, if a Japanese person says, I sink instead of I think, I'm going to catch that meaning.
Yeah.
It's not going to make a huge difference. Sometimes it can, but for the most part, I'll get around it. But when the vowel sound is off, I struggle with the meaning.
Yeah. I think that's hugely important to recognize that even us as English teachers, and we have a lot of experience trying to understand what people really want to say. And if a Brazilian, exactly like you said, if a Brazilian says to me, think instead of think, I'm going to get that. But if they are really missing a key vowel sound, like most Brazilians really struggle with the I sound in words like it, sit. If they don't have that sound in their arsenal somewhere, that's just like a constant struggle for me to think like, okay, what are they trying to say here? So it just seems to kind of give them bigger holes in their language is kind of the way I see it.
Yeah, it's well put. I mean, for Japanese, they don't have the English A sound like in cat, and they'll substitute the Japanese A sound, which is like a U sound.
Yeah.
So, if they want to say my ankle is hurt, it's going to sound like my uncle is hurt, which
Yeah.
is just a totally different meaning.
Yeah. That can be problematic.
Yes.